Hi, everyone. Welcome to another LinkedIn Live discussion brought to you by Optiv, the Cyber Advisory and Solutions Leader. My name is John Miller. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Optiv, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. I'm really excited to talk to you about the evolution of PAM, or Privileged Access Management. Today, we're going to be diving through the advancement over the years, current trends we're seeing, and how it's being applied by organizations around the world. Our experts are going to be talking about their insights on PAM, as well as best practices when it comes to navigating the ever evolving landscape of the cybersecurity and how PAM is being used. As we're going through today's discussion, feel free to enter your questions into the chat so we can talk about them later on in today's discussion. Also, feel free to check out this asset by Optiv. It talks about the evolution of PAM in more detail, so you can take that back and discuss it with your colleagues and peers. As for experts, I'm going to now introduce who's going to be talking to us today. First is Crystal Trani. She's a practice director at Optiv and over 17 years experience in the identity and data management space. She's very knowledgeable in the identity and access management policies, operational support, and of course, PAM. She delivers projects all over the US as well as many different industry verticals. We also have Nick Barrett. He's a practice manager on our PAM team. He has a very diverse background in IT and business and helps organizations implement PAM to meet their unique business requirements and security needs. So, given both of your experience in PAM, you're probably in a really good space to explain to me and our viewers about how PAM has evolved over the years. I'm sure you've seen a lot of change in both technology and people and processes. Can you walk me through PAM and how it's evolved over the years and how organizations need to be thinking about PAM today? So, Nick, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you. In the beginning of, doing implementations for our customers, right? The first question I would get, I walk into an office and say, "Oh, great, you're the PAM guy. You're here to install PAM. That's awesome. What's PAM?" So that was, we were starting from there a lot of times where we were explaining to people what the core software does. I said, "Well, it changes passwords." It says, "Great. Why do I need this application to change passwords for me?" It says, "Well, not your password, this is for other accounts that you use, accounts that live on the system." We'd usually use like Windows Administrator or root accounts as a good example. And that's what people would often do too, right? Is like they would manage those built-in accounts. But the problem with that approach is sort of that they would manage those accounts because they weren't using them, and really like nobody was using them, and so they were just managing, doing that to check a box, sort of. So the problem was that those accounts represented a small risk to the organization because attackers needed, better and more powerful accounts, right? But those were the ones that we weren't managing at that time.
Crystal, what have you been seeing with the evolution? You've probably been seeing things change over the years.
Yeah, and I think where Nick kind of left off, where we started to where we are. And I think we're just seeing that sprawl of privilege and the redefinition of what privilege means. And I know it's cliche, data is power, but just in those regards, if you think about some of the privileges we have and access to the data or even access to create data on behalf of our companies can sometimes be, if that were compromised by an attacker, then that would do some pretty good damage to company reputation and things like that. So I think we're starting to see that people are not only just doing the vaulting accounts, but then realizing how much impact that their everyday access may have to the company if something were to happen.
From back in the day when PAM was really starting out till today, have people changed the way that they thought about PAM and what a privileged access account would be?
I think, some companies have. I've come from a different company before Optiv. I think financials are a place where people, from a data perspective, we always felt like there was privilege there. So I think in the financial industry, there's some of those people are looking at it a little bit differently as it relates to the financial data, et cetera, and who gets access to those things. Maybe you think that is a little more like separation of duties, but ultimately this plays perfectly into the way that identity has evolved in general, where it's kind of coming in together, right? PAM was a subset of identity before, and now we're seeing it really just evolve into really that whole fabric where privilege is being used, what people have elevated access, whether you're an HR admin or you have access to the company Twitter account. And I think people are realizing that.
It's really interesting thinking how Twitter accounts have become almost like a privileged access where people need to monitor that. I think we've seen in the real world where people take over those accounts how much damage that can do to an organization and their reputation, how much work it takes to clean that up. So, Nick, given your experience with clients implementing PAM, what have you seen organizations focusing on and how they're applying PAM?
I think what Crystal was getting at is the number one thing that I see changing. The definition of like what is a privileged account, quote unquote. So your privilege is everywhere, right? And before, this was an IT tool, right? So we would always be working with IT admins, and the target audience for the product would always be some sort of related IT group, whether it was domain admins or DBAs or whatever it was. But it was always an IT focused type of product. And now what we're seeing is it's going sort of organization wide, right? It's like Crystal was saying, like there's accounting tools that could be involved, or it could be your social media. There could be HR tools. So all of these sort of people before that we considered business users, quote unquote, if you will, are now actually, what we're finding out is those accounts can be abused. Like think of the impact of somebody compromising the admin account for your financial system, right? They can get access to a lot of sensitive information about your organization, or if they're there to be more on the destructive side, then they can do that as well. And it's something that this all sort of stems from ransomware changing the game before, because the data, data exfiltration was sort of the goal of an attack before. And organizations had that calculated, right? It's like, okay, well, here's sort of the number of records we have. Here's our maximum total loss because we have to buy credit monitoring for all our customers or whatever. And then they had that number in mind. But now the reason this is expanding in scope is because ransomware essentially takes away your license to operate your business, right? Like all your machines are locked up. So you're not doing transactions anymore, and you're losing whatever you sort of make in a day as a whole business. You could be losing that. So we're seeing that sort of trend go toward all business users.
Now, ransomware doesn't just hit big organizations and large organizations. It pretty much hits everyone these days, even the small and medium businesses, mid-sized. So for organizations that may not have PAM already, who are re-looking at this time, why is now maybe a good time to re-look at PAM? How has the technology changed and the feeling about PAM changed in an organization? So Crystal, I'll toss that one to you.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the ways that the technology has changed is I think we're seeing a lot more ability to do the just-in-time access that we talked about. So it really plays into those zero standing privileges. And so for, places that don't have either feel like they have a lot of privilege because they're small or they don't have a large team, that could be a good place to start, is really leaning into the, do you really want to go traditional PAM and vault everything? Or do you have an opportunity to really analyze and say, can I do some kind of just-in-time access, even if you did it in a phased approach? Because what we've learned about PAM projects is it's not necessarily the technology, it's the change that really kind of gets people. So that's when it's really important to have some folks along your side on your team to say, hey, how do we see other people implement some of these things so that it's still safe for your business and you're not, kind of stepping into something that, interrupts business operations, which in turn gets you a black eye, which in turn means that people don't really love having your projects implemented. So you want that to have those little successes, but I'm seeing some of that. And then I would say what I really like that's coming out is all the analytics. And so I think we've seen some previous opportunities where there were some on-premise things that had analytics. Now you're seeing a lot more cloud products that incorporate analytics, and analytics that actually inform the user, not just alert until you're tired of seeing it and shut it off, but tell you what the alert is and what the concern is, like why that's a concern, which I think is really closes the loop for a lot of users, so they don't have to know every vulnerability and why that's important.
Right. So we just had a question come in and speak about just in time. Does just in time lend better to an on-prem PAM environment or implementation, or a SaaS environment? Throw out to Crystal, since we were just talking about just in
Yeah,
time.
I mean, I'll take it. I thought maybe
Yeah.
Nick looked like you maybe had a thought about it, but I mean, I don't think there's any difference, right? I feel like the just in time it's a little more process related than it is, SaaS or on-prem related. I think people are getting over the concern that just because I have a SaaS environment, at some point I'm going to get locked out of all of my accounts or things like that, and I have to have it on-prem. There's some regulatory reasons why people keep the on-premise, or they're just not a cloud-first organization, but I don't see any difference in that. I don't know, Nick, if you have more to add there.
I think they're coming out. The vendors are coming out with specialized just-in-time tools, whereas prior it was part of like the core application, and there's lots of instances where like people who could really configure the applications well would. I don't want to say abuse it. It's the wrong way to say it, but we say, well, we can make it do that thing, right? And we would do that, but it wasn't specialized at doing that thing. But now, what we're seeing is like specialized just-in-time tools. So those are being created first in the cloud. Some of those features are trickling back to on-prem, but some of like the totally different, products basically are cloud only. So I think cloud is really the way to go there. I don't think you lose anything by going cloud.
You mentioned that. I think that ties really nicely into the evolution, how as PAM has evolved, so has the advancements in technology and capabilities to meet how people are using it today. The just in time, it's all built into the workflows. It's a key functionality in a piece out there. So actually, let's pivot a little bit to some questions here. So with that, what current PAM solutions are out there that is applicable for someone that maybe doesn't have PAM already and wants to dip their toe into it?
And you mean regarding like functionality and things like that, John, when you
Yeah,
ask
like
that?
what major vendors are out there? What functionality should they think about? Given now that maybe they've looked in the past at PAM, but didn't fit them. But now, since it's evolved so much, now they're re-looking at it, and where should they be honing in their sights?
So I think Nick, maybe you can comment on like some of the small, medium businesses that we talk to. What are some of the things that you feel like they should be concerned about, right? Because they're the ones that are maybe have not been required from a regulatory perspective, but now maybe from a cyber insurance perspective are really in the PAM game, if you were.
Yeah, cyber insurance has been a huge driver, and I think what people should be looking at from a vendor perspective is the entirety of the platform. So these vendors are basically saying, hey, before you were buying a point solution for like, let's say endpoint management, for example, and a different point solution for PAM, core PAM like change password, session management, all that. Now you can look at buying into like an ecosystem where all of these features are provided sort of and you light up those features as you need them and as it applies to your project, and or maybe just to reflect back on what you were saying, or as your cyber insurance provider is requiring of you, right? Because their requirements are also changing. The cyber insurance requirements we saw years ago are not the same as the ones today. They're evaluating these tools more deeply, your implementation of these tools more deeply. So you really have to consider, what platform is going to fit your use cases.
It's a little bit like I feel like when the old audit days, right? the first time you get an auditor, maybe they're not really sure what they're looking for, so you give them you give them a base
Mhm.
answer, and then the next year they come back and they're like, okay, I got a little bit smarter in this tool, and so now I'm
That's
going to go a little bit deeper, and I want you to prove to me that it actually does the thing that you said that it did, or that you
yeah.
actually provisioned the access at the time you said. And now cyber insurance companies are doing much of the same. They're getting a little more wise, and there's more, specifications and loopholes, right, that people have to be wary of as far as how they're implementing the respective tools.
That brings up a good point. It's probably things you have to. PAM is maybe a program and not a project. You're gonna have to think about this year over year as regulations change, as or auditors come in and want different things.
Hmm.
Um, so one
And
question
I
I have
think,
is what? Go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say, I think, John, that's a great point, right? As you get into your program, it's just like anything in identity. I've had this conversation many times with clients. Um, I don't want to say there's no point when you're done, but you do have to operationalize a lot of, what you're doing. It's not a set it and forget it. You have to decide, what your strategy is going to be, how you're going to implement the strategy from, a PAM perspective, or if you want to go endpoint perspective, you're putting operational processes in place to make sure that any privileged account that gets created, or any new server that gets created, those kinds of things end up in the same process, so that you're not creating more problems as you're solving some. And that goes the same way in identity, as far as like access provisioning and things like that. You're always having to maintain those roles, and what the real rules are for those operations, so that that everything's functioning the same way. There's things to onboard, and then there's always things to sunset,
Hmm.
even from an automation perspective.
One thing that I don't think we
Okay.
mentioned is that the tools are getting easier. That's when we talk about the evolution. I should have chimed in with that part earlier, or should have brought that up earlier, right? Like these integrations. So when you're talking about like integrating into the identity workflow, all that stuff has become much easier over the past 10 years, or 15 years, or 16 years, or 17, however long we've been doing this.
Hmm.
And I think that's important to note, because before it was like people would look at all the configurations that we could make to make these products work for your organization. It's like their eyes would get wide, and then they would get a little bit glassy, and then they'd start like looking for the exits and stuff when I would be walking them through this. But a lot of that's been drastically simplified now too. And I think what Crystal was saying, like the integration with the identity part is important.
Hmm. I mean, PAM is probably just one component of a larger piece with identity. Identity is becoming more and more important. So one question we have here is how's identity being expanded in terms of tools and processes due for the need for PAM? So how are we thinking? How should we be thinking about identity and PAM coming together, and identity being a key driver of PAM?
Yeah, I mean, I see identity as, or PAM as, I've always seen PAM as a subset of identity. I don't think that maybe the market has always responded that way, because they tend to be separate groups, right? PAM, again, going back to Nick's thing, has been traditionally IT driven. But as you see what's happening, if you think about identity as a base, it's like, who am I within the company? And what do I have access to do, right? What should I be allowed to do, and when, sometimes, right? And so alongside that is, maybe I have privilege, maybe that is part of my identity at work. And how does that function? And if we go back to earlier when we were saying, how you could leverage just in time access, I could literally have zero standing privileges, still maintain my same job within my company, and then when I have to log in, once a year to do something on a server, it just elevates automatically, right? And then gets rid of it. And I don't have to deal with all of the rest of my manager checking and saying, yes, I still need that access, and all that other stuff. So
Mhm.
I think it folds really nicely into identity, and in my identity opinion. I feel like I've been doing this a long time. So,
Mhm.
it for me, it was like an easy step over to, privilege from like the identity fabric.
So we have a question here from Sean, and it sounds like what are some prerequisites to think about as an organization is looking to address PAM? Is there anything you need to have completed or ready to go before you go and jump into bringing on a PAM solution? And what might those prerequisites be? So, Nick, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think you have to, your initial project is important. And when you're implementing a PAM tool for the first time, there can be like a little organizational static, or people are like, hey, what is this? You're taking our, passwords away from us, whatever it is. So the prerequisites for me is like, hey, let's define a small, a tightly defined project. Like, we want to target these accounts in phase one, these accounts in phase two. And then that way you can show that progress, right? Like, what we want our customers to do is be able to say, okay, we set out to do this small chunk, and now we've done that. It's worked well. Improve that, right, to sort of their internal customers, if you will. And then, okay, and move on to the next one. And you can trust this system, and you can rely on this system. And look, we have, other groups that have been using it and stuff like that. As far as from a technical perspective, I don't think there's necessarily a lot that you can do to prepare for that. There may be. I mean, Crystal, I'll give it to you if you think there's some maybe more technical items that you'd like to see customers prepare.
More technical or less?
Or other ones as well.
I always feel like communication is the biggest one, to be honest. One of the best conversations that I've had on the consulting side was with a client who, like Nick was saying, they had a very defined scope. We had outlined it as such. We got into the kickoff call. They invited all the friends. And somebody got off on a little side story about, hey, when are we going to do this for XYZ, which was out of scope. And I was so proud of the stakeholder. He came in and he said, that's out of scope for phase one. We're going to put it in phase two. And one of the very first conversations that I remember having with this gentleman, I always ask, how much have you talked about this internally? And he said, we have talked about this. Everyone knows that it's coming. And, I think that really showed in that moment that they had talked about it, that most of the people on the call knew what the focus was, and that he maintained that focus. Now, if you've seen a couple of my other conversations that we've had or talked to me at events, I say a lot of goals of like being able to pivot to a new end goal is always a good thing as well in identity, because things happen and business requirements change, right? The needs of the business sometimes pivot. And so sometimes you go in there with a set scope and you do change, and you change it on purpose. But I think that is one of the things, is knowing what you're going after, being able to communicate that. And if you are going to shift, then make sure that it's for a good reason. And you can either defer the other thing to a different phase, et cetera. And I think we're pretty good about advising our clients as well on why things are separated. But when it makes a business sense to pull a certain use case from phase 3 to phase 1, we can do it. You just have to know and communicate.
Speaking of use cases, kind of one of the last thing I want to ask you is making PAM real. We've talked a lot about how PAM has moved over time and evolved in different ways. Organizations are thinking about it, but what are some real life applications of PAM that show how organizations are using it today? So I'll also start with you, Crystal.
So real client stories about PAM. I mean, gosh, we have so many stories that we have going on. I mean, I think, they're doing some of the traditional use cases. We're seeing people go more into those application areas, or service accounts is a really big one that it feels like right now. And usually those are more complicated conversations because, let's be honest, we create a service account and then nobody really remembers what it was for, and we didn't label it, and it doesn't have an owner, and maybe that person left the organization. So there's all sorts of little nuancy things, or we've leveraged at several places. for several different applications within the organization. So you're not really sure what's going to break if you start rotating that. And it becomes very concerning for the clients because they don't want to shut off their operational items, obviously.
Right.
And so, again, another famous thing that I said that everybody cringes is at my previous job, we would do a whole campaign about service accounts, and we would find an owner, and if the owner didn't exist, you basically have 30 days. And on day 30, I was probably shutting it off, and everybody kind of gasped a little bit. But I will tell you that I found out really fast what it was for, if it was even
Mhm.
being used, because someone would show up at my desk. And maybe that would happen to like 1 out of 25 accounts or something like that. And the other ones were just old legacy. So I think we're
Mhm.
seeing that a little bit more. I don't, Nick, if you have something else that's also interesting about a customer story.
Well, John, you said making it more real, right? And the other day I was watching the news and they said, attacks on municipal water supplies actually are up, and are actually
Mhm.
really concerning, right? And so it seems like I've heard a lot about this recently. Like they increased, the chlorine concentration essentially in the water supply of a local municipality, and it's like these are
Mhm.
the things that we want to protect, right? So we're getting into
Right.
projects like this, you know, protecting that operational technology. The things that are actually,
Yes.
it's like I don't know, I don't really know what it is, but it's like the little
Mhm.
dial that controls how much chlorine is in the water or whatever, and it's things that protect the electrical grid. Utilities is a really big thing, and it has really practical implications on all of our lives, right? It's like
Right.
you really need to be able to trust your water. You really want your
Mhm.
electricity. Like I really like the lights on in my house right now. That's great. So these are really practical, things that we're starting to
Right.
see as well.
Pretty interesting how we had a previous LinkedIn Live about operational technology. Now we're talking about PAM, and it's all coming together because of how these industries, these utilities, the critical infrastructure is so important, obviously, to keep running for just civilization. But it is PAM is at front and center with protecting it. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions and time we have today. I want to thank you both for your time, for your PAM expertise, sharing it with myself and the viewers, and how it's being applied to real worlds and how organizations who are maybe new on their journey to PAM can get involved, can get started on PAM and get it implemented so they can protect their organization and their privileged accounts. So I want to thank everyone for joining. Thank you for your questions and participating. If you are interested in learning more about Optiv's PAM solutions or anything cybersecurity from Optiv, feel free to contact us at optiv.com. Thanks and have a wonderful day.